Good morning. My name is Jessica Jaganzik, and I'm the Vice President of Events for the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you so much for joining us. Like many of you, we've been working from home while still continuing the important work of the Council to host informed, nonpartisan discussions on important national and international topics. I miss seeing all of you at our events, and I hope we can resume those events when it is safe. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten all of your dietary preferences. In the meantime, until we can meet again in person, I'm asking for you to continue to support these discussions and this public forum by renewing your membership or making a tax-deductible contribution today. It's the last day of the fiscal year for us, and it would be wonderful to end it strong and provide a solid foundation to push into the new year, to keep bringing you great speakers, whether they be in person or, as it stands right now, from my living room. Please visit our website at lawalk.org to see how you can support our mission so that we can continue to bring you these quality interactive live streams. It is now my pleasure to welcome back to the Council Dr. Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations and author of the new book, The World, A Brief Introduction. The discussion will be moderated by Doyle McManus, Washington columnist for the Los Angeles Times. For those of you who are joining us online, we'll be taking questions in about 20 minutes. You should see a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen with an area for questions that you can type in. I will come back on to read them during the question portion, and we'll get to as many as I can. Without further ado, Doyle, I turn the discussion over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, and I want to thank my old Stanford classmate Kim McCleary for the introduction, the invitation to the World Affairs Council, and I also want to say hello at this point, without seeing you, to all of my old friends in LA whom I haven't been able to visit for the last 4 months, but I promise I will be there as soon as the beaches reopen. So let me know when that happens. Back in the early days of the Cold War, there was a group of foreign policy sages who became known as the wise men. They were people who were experienced enough and smart enough to advise presidents of both political parties. And if we had a list of wise men today, our guest, whom you all know from his time at the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, would undeniably be on it. He has served several Republican presidents, but he also takes phone calls from Democrats as well. And so we're delighted to have him. Richard has done something quite audacious, and that is, if I can get this in the picture, he's attempted to summarize the world, all its problems, all its structural problems, as well as its regional problems, in only 300 pages. And the book has an interesting origin story that even has a California angle. So Richard, tell us where this book came from.
Well, thank you, Doyle. Great to see you. And if people are writing checks to councils today as the end of the fiscal year, there's another council headquartered back east. They shouldn't hold back. We're not too proud. And by the way, I also worked for a Democratic president. I worked at the Pentagon for a guy named Carter back when even you were young. Look, the story does have a California angle. I was, of all things, fishing. Normally I golf. In this case, I was fishing off of Nantucket. And there was this young man going into his senior year at Stanford, and he was a computer sciences major, very bright, very articulate. And I'd said just offhandedly, I'm curious, what history courses does a computer sciences major at Stanford take? And it turned out he really hadn't taken any. And I said, well, that's okay. Like, well, what economics courses or political science courses? And before any fish nibbled on the line, it was clear to me that this young man was a year away from graduating from one of the world's great universities, and essentially wouldn't have important elements of what we used to call a liberal arts education. And when I went back to my office in New York, it became clear also that he wasn't unique, that you can graduate from virtually any high school and from most 2- and 4-year colleges in this country and not have much of a background in this world you're going to enter, and this world that's going to affect your life. And the courses are offered in many places, they're just not required, or there are so many courses that could fulfill a requirement. They're so generously defined that, again, you could be, for all intents and purposes, illiterate about international relations, about the world you're going to enter. And what I decided to do, the more I looked at it, was I realized this wasn't unique to young people. It was also true of older people. Nightly news gave you very little. Most newspapers don't give you a lot. If you did study it when you went in college, if you're now my generation, what you studied is no longer particularly relevant. The Cold War is 30 years in the past. So I decided to try to write a primer, or as the Brits call it, a primer, in one book in 300 pages to basically say, here's what I think you need to be an informed citizen. So I say when you go to the polls this November, you're better informed, you have a better sense of what the issues are, what questions to ask, how to hold elected people or officials to account, how to make better, say, career decisions. Should I go into the military, the foreign service? How to make better investment decisions? Business decisions? Should I open a factory here or there? And that's the idea, Doyle, is to essentially give people a foundation so they can make better decisions, whether it's professionally, personally, or politically.
But it's not only a how-to book, it also has an argument. One of the interesting things you do in your preface is you give a tip to readers who already know the basics of foreign policy and say you may want to skip to the end, which I did. I took your advice. It's actually a quite eloquent argument on behalf of what used to be called liberal internationalism, on behalf of American engagement. And both of those are causes that are no longer consensus causes, or may not be consensus principles anymore. Are you sailing against the wind on this one?
Well, quite possibly. Again, it's one of the motives for writing the book. Here we are, we live in this world, and think about it. We learned on 9/11 that what happens in Afghanistan affects us. Now we've learned that what starts in Wuhan doesn't stay in Wuhan. People in California don't need lectures about climate change and fires or storms. Yet again, we're living at a time where understanding of how the world works and why it matters seems to be increasingly missing for a lot of people. And also there's a feedback loop. The world affects us, but also what we do and don't do affects the world. So I am swimming against the tide in a sense, but I've got a passion here. I want more people to get informed. I want more people to understand the linkages in both directions. The world does matter, and it affects us also. So, and I don't think we're well served by either a government or a society that doesn't understand the linkages between the United States and the world.
You wrote this book, and of course, planned it before the pandemic hit. But you do have a chapter in it on global health, and it stands up pretty well because it says that pandemics and health are going to be an increasing or recurring problem, and that we have a problem in that the international consensus and the international institutions are weak on that. If you were going to expand that chapter, which in a sense, which not just in a sense, quite directly supports your principal argument about an interlinked world, what would you have written in it?
Well, again, just to begin where you left off, it does support the fact, one, that the world matters, that isolationism is not an option. We may not like what started in Wuhan, but here it is all the same. And I also think, the other message of the book is not only do we ignore the world at our peril, but unilateralism is not a preferable approach. There's nothing we can do better alone than we can do with others. So take now where we are with global health. I actually agree with critics who say the World Health Organization, shall we say, is flawed or imperfect. But to simply defund it or walk away, I don't see how that leaves us better off. So the argument of my book is we should then either think about improving the World Health Organization or coming up with another approach. And I'm easy on that. When it came to HIV/AIDS, we actually created complementary or supplementary global arrangements for dealing with it. Maybe that's the best approach with infectious disease. So when COVID-20 or COVID-25 comes down the pike, we're better able to contend with it. But but what's consistent in all of this again is we're not immune to it. These things are going to come, and there's no reason, there's no rationale for our doing it unilaterally.
There is no explicit critique of the Trump administration or its foreign policy in the book, but you're arguing for engagement, you're arguing against unilateralism. That sounds like an implicit critique that I'm now going to invite you to make more explicit.
It is an implicit critique. The book is not meant as an argument book. I've written a lot of those. And it's different than an article would be, say, in Foreign Affairs magazine. This is meant as a primer. I'm not trying to persuade people for the most part. I want to, again, give them foundational knowledge. History is what it is. The regions of the world are what they are. Global challenges are what they are. Now, you're right. I have those two biases, that globalization's a reality, not a choice. How we respond to it's a choice. And the response, in my view, ought not to be unilateral. That is a criticism for the most part. I think in many cases, what was said about healthcare, the administration was repeal without replace. I think that's also true of a lot of its foreign policy. We've withdrawn from any number of international agreements, treaties, organizations. And I'm not against that per se, on the condition that we're better off. In most cases, indeed in every case, I don't see us better off. I think it's a gesture, it's a political message, and I don't see us creating something better instead of what it was we're critical of, or we've defunded, or we've withdrawn from. So yes, if that's so I guess there's my explicit statement based upon the implicit.
But it's also an argument that isn't personal about Donald Trump. It's an argument and a piece of persuasion about these principles.
Exactly, and it'd be true of any other president. And look, for 150 years of American history, up to World War II, the United States was largely isolationist. Indeed, the organization I'm lucky enough to lead was created in the aftermath of World War I, in part to discourage a revival of isolationism. It failed. League of Nations, was rejected, as everybody knows. So I think so Donald Trump is in a tradition, to some extent, of isolationism. He's also unilateralist in many ways. He's also protectionist in many ways, where he's unique. None of his predecessors tweeted, to the best of my knowledge. I don't think, President Jackson or others had access to Twitter. But I do think he is very much in an American tradition. This is not ad hominem. I know him. During the campaign, I met with him, and I made certain arguments about America's role in the world. I would say any influence I had is not evident, but I made those arguments. Again, you mentioned when you introduced me, I've worked for Democrats and Republicans. I'm not partisan. I have very strong views. But actually, I don't find foreign policy lines up neatly between the Democrats and Republicans. Within each party, there are tendencies I applaud and tendencies I have issues with. And so I've never been, for better and for worse, I don't feel at all partisan. I just feel passionate.
You're quite right that this is a tendency. The tendency toward disengagement has appeared in both parties. And it's still there. It was there before Donald Trump. He didn't invent it. Now, to some degree, when you come to the World Affairs Council, when you lead the Council on Foreign Relations, you're preaching to the choir here on this issue. Everybody here is an internationalist one way or another. If any of the presidential candidates were to come to you and say, how do we persuade the American people that more engagement, that renewed commitment to alliances, that more investment overseas, and that looking at globalization as an opportunity, not only as a threat, that all of these things are very much in our interest, how do you make that case?
I think it is a strong case to be made. Look, exports are obviously good for American workers. Trade is important for us. Yes, some jobs have been lost because of trade, but many more jobs have been created. Inflation is down because of imports. Choice is greater because of imports. The world is more democratic than it was. So I think there's a lot about the world that is good. But what I would tell an American president is you've got to talk to the American people about it. Think about the great communicators we've had in the Oval Office: FDR, JFK, Ronald Reagan. And they talked to the American people, and they often took the American people to places they weren't inclined to go. Certainly FDR did that. And I think what you'd have to show is why the world matters. We've had some very graphic demonstrations. Also, a lot of people are working under misinformation, as we used to say, about costs. What we're spending on defense, what we're spending on foreign policy now is roughly half what we averaged during the Cold War. We've had great periods of American economic growth while we spent a lot more than we spend now. So what I think you could show is the benefits from American involvement in the world are considerable. The costs are affordable. The costs of not being in the world are potentially great. And by the way, our domestic problems don't stem from what we're not spending. We spend far above the OECD average on healthcare or education. The last I checked, we're not getting our money's worth. It's not how much you spend, it's how you spend it. So I think there are really good arguments, and a president would have to invest the time. But I don't think the American people are inflexibly isolationist. I just think in some cases, again, it comes back to the book, because a lot of them haven't thought about these issues. They're too busy living their lives. They didn't study these issues. I think a president needs to make some connections.
Okay, over the last 4 months, naturally, Americans have been drawn inward. We are less outward looking in a sense than we were 4 months ago, if only because of the multiple crises we're dealing with domestically. What is out there in the world that worries you most, that's going to be on on the inbox of the next national security advisor, whoever that turns out to be? They change in both parties. That's not a judgment on who will be the president. What problems has our attention strayed from?
It's a long list, and actually one of the things I'd say is whoever wins this election, he is going to be greeted by a daunting inbox. You think about all the traditional troubles, renewed great power rivalry, a turbulent or worse Middle East. 1 out of every 100 people in the world is internally displaced or refugee. You got climate change. You still will have the pandemic. You have the possibility of other pandemics. You've got North Korea with a growing nuclear and missile arsenal. You got Iran causing mayhem in the region and gradually moving beyond the 2015 agreement. You've got Venezuela. So you have got Russia and Ukraine, Georgia. I mean, you've got a big list of both old-fashioned as well as newfangled international challenges. So I got a long list, but I would highlight probably China and U.S.-Chinese relations. It is the bilateral relationship of this era. Obviously, I worry about climate change, and I worry that it's been in some ways pushed to the side. We're going to be so focused on renewed economic growth that I worry that climate change is going to get lost in the shuffle. I don't hear enough people saying, okay, if we give PPP to this or that business, can we make it conditional on, for example, not using coal? Or if you're an automobile manufacturer and you're going to get $1 gazillion from the government, why can't we link it to raise auto fuel economy standards? I mean, I think there's ways, so I worry about that. But more than anything, it goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago, Doyle. I worry about the United States. The biggest change in international relations over the last 5 years is not China, it's not North Korea, it's not Iran, it's not Venezuela, it's us. And we, for the last 70 odd years, were what I would call the principal architect and general contractor of what order there's been in the world. And by the way, it's gone pretty well when one looks at this period of history compared to others. And I worry that we've stopped doing it. And there's no one else to pick up the slack. And so if I were advising an American president, I would say, yes, invest in China, the relationship. Yes, think about climate change. We can go, every one of the things we just mentioned is grounds for worry, and a lot more things. But a lot of it is us. And what I would do is spend time with the American people, with Congress and the rest, working it. And probably where I'd begin, if I had to say, would be with allies. The great structural advantage of American foreign policy is we've got partners. We've got allies. We've got several dozen in Europe. We've got Japan. We've got South Korea. We've got Australia, to some extent India. Well, that's a lot of the world. That's what, 2/3, 3/4 of the GDP of the world, more than half the world's people. Well, let's work together and let's think about what we can do to deal with every one of those specific regional and global challenges. So I would probably begin with the American people, the revival of American alliances, and then I just focus on critical countries and critical global issues.
And if you get into that meeting, the national security advisor would probably say, okay, that's good. I get point one, I get point two. Now tell me about China. What do we do about China?
Well, again, what we want to do is understand what's realistic. And I would say we want to change Chinese behavior, particularly abroad, also at home to some extent. But we're not going to transform China. It's not going to become a liberal democracy. It's not going to become capitalist. So let's accept that. What we want to do, though, is limit some of their worst behaviors at home. And what we really want to do is shape their external behavior, both to discourage them from doing negative things against India, the South China Sea, Taiwan, what have you. And we want them to be helpful on things like North Korea or climate change. And again, what I would do, the first thing I'd probably do there is I would try to figure out a way for the United States getting back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We'd have to renegotiate the terms, fair enough. They would have, we'd have to decide what we wanted. The 11 or so members would have to decide what they're prepared to do. But that's a great way to build a common basis for approaching China economically. I would strengthen our alliances with South Korea, Japan, our strategic relationship with India. So essentially what I would do is let China know that economically it was going to have to change its ways if it wanted to have the access it wants to these markets. They were not going to be able to use force with impunity against their neighbors. And I would also, by the way, do more here at home. We can't stop China from having 5G or investing heavily in AI or quantum computers. So let's outcompete them. Let's increase the amount of money we're spending on basic research. Let's have a smart immigration policy where we attract and keep really talented people. Let's improve our infrastructure. Let's improve our K through 12 education and so forth. There's things we can and should do so we're more competitive. But mainly I would approach China much more from a collective position. And I don't want a new Cold War. I think if we end up in a new Cold War, it would be a major loss. And the 21st century would be much worse for it. And I would tell either my Secretary of State, I would hope the President would tell either the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor or somebody senior, I want you to have a real strategic conversation with China. And from this position of revived strength and collectiveness with our allies, I would basically tell China, look, we're not trying to change who you are fundamentally, but here, you should just know that if you act in certain ways, this will be the consequences. You decide, you're a sovereign country. But I think we have the ability. Look, to me, what foreign policy is mostly about, it's influencing the foreign policies of others. I think in recent years, we've gotten too ambitious in terms of trying to influence their domestic nature. And I think that's probably a bridge too far, both left and right. I think we can affect some of what they do within their borders, but mainly we want to affect their foreign policies. And that would be the focus of US-Chinese relations.
Now, as you know, there are plenty of people who argue, well, that all sounds nice, but it also sounds a little bit like the debates we were having about China 5 years ago and 10 years ago. What we have discovered or come to understand, the argument goes, is that the Chinese Communist Party is bent on maximizing, extending Chinese power in an old-fashioned geopolitical sense. And so you may not want to have a Cold War, but we are stuck. This really goes back to some of the debates people had about the origins of the Cold War in 1947 and 1948, right? We're not starting this Cold War because we don't like the Chinese. They're starting this Cold War because they're trying to establish hegemony in their region. Is that a fair argument? And are you essentially saying we're not there yet?
We are not there yet. I also think that Chinese global ambitions are finite. I think China's look, every country has sets of interests. I think the first set of interests for Chinese leaders is that the Communist Party maintain power in China, and that Chinese, what they consider to be the integrity of China as a country, is not violated. And for them, that means all reaches, including Hong Kong, including from their point of view, Taiwan. And I do not think that China has the equivalent of Russia had, or Soviet Union had, excuse me, in terms of global ambitions. So I don't think it's impossible, therefore, to work out with China a modus vivendi. We've done it for 40 years on Taiwan. So that shows me it's possible. Now, China's stronger now. And what we need to do, again, is to make China realize that if it were to tried to change the status of Taiwan coercively, that would be resisted. I believe that needs to be made clear to them. But no, I don't think it's hopeless. Look, I do what I do for a living. I believe in diplomacy. I believe in statecraft. I don't think there's a lot that's inexorable or inevitable. I don't think we're past the point of no return. Is it a possibility the United States and China end up in a Cold War? Sure. But both sides would pay a price for it. And it would be a failure of diplomacy on both sides. Neither country would be better off. So my goal is, look, if it takes two to avoid it, I get it. And if China is hell-bent on having one, they'll have it. But I don't think they are. And I do think it's avoidable on terms that would be preferable for us. At a minimum, I could be wrong, but at a minimum, we'd want to explore the possibility of avoiding a more confrontational relationship with China. If it proves to be beyond reach, so be it. But you don't want to end up in that kind of a situation without first having explored all the alternatives.
Fair enough. I want to go ahead and let the members of the council have a chance to ask their question. And so let me turn the microphone over to Jessica. I should warn you, Richard, that I have the bad habit of, as a moderator, of asking a follow-up if I don't think the answer was crisp enough.
Thank you so much.
Which I know will not daunt you one bit.
I am now forewarned. Okay, I got my.
It was meant as a courtesy rather than a warning.
Thank you, sir.
All right, our first question. With such an abundance of foreign policy and global leadership crises confronting the United States, how should a post-Trump administration execute triage in addressing the damage in bilateral and multilateral relations, from Paris climate and Iran nuclear agreements and arms control to reduced commitments to NATO and Asian allies, Japan and South Korea? What should the first priorities be? That's a long question. It's from Carol Williams, who is a retired foreign correspondent for the LA Times.
Again, I don't think the answer is any different from whether it's Mr. Trump in a second term or Mr. Biden in a first term. I think we need to deal with some of the domestic challenges. National security has a domestic dimension. And if we're a country that's ravaged by COVID-19, we're tens of millions unemployed, divided by politics, divided by race, it's going to be very hard for us to have the bandwidth to deal with international challenges. So part of what any president needs to do is try to heal and deal with domestic challenges. Second of all, I talked about alliances. They're the greatest force multipliers available to the United States. So rather than hammering allies over burden sharing or threatening to pull troops out of Germany, I would looking to find ways to revive our alliances. And as I said, if I had to choose two structural issues, I'd choose U.S.-Chinese relations and climate change. But then you've got all the particulars. You mentioned them. North Korea, Iran, Venezuela. We go around the world. There'll be no shortage of issues for. And I'm not real comfortable with the triage concept. It's not like you've got a wine cellar when it comes to foreign policy, and you can park a couple of good bottles there for a couple of years and then get to them when you're ready to, and you'll find out the Bordeaux has ripened. It doesn't work that way. Bad problems get worse by and large. North Korea has gotten worse over the last 3 years. Now, we've been talking about denuclearization, and they're busy nuclearizing and missilizing. Other situations have gotten worse, like climate change, like Venezuela. So look, that's the reason you've got secretaries and deputy secretaries and undersecretaries and assistant secretaries. I would resist the idea that certain things are priorities for the president or the secretary of state. I get it. But the government as a whole has the capacity. One of the things we're going to have to do, therefore, is really rebuild capacity. This administration has put itself behind the eight ball. You've got all these challenges up there, some naturally occurring, some of our own making. And our capacity for dealing with them is actually diminished. So at the same time, we're going to have to rebuild certain capacities. Some things can be done immediately. You can appoint talented ambassadors. You can appoint experienced, talented hands for the chief lieutenants in the departments. Other things like reviving a foreign service, that's the work of a generation. But some things you can do right away.
Thank you so much. What sources do you refer to on a daily basis to learn of world news? Today, the popular news sources are dominated by local political news, but virtually nothing about world news.
I mean, after I get done reading whatever Mr. McManus has written for his, I do a few things. And I don't claim that I'm typical in a sense, it's what I do for a living, but I read about a half dozen newspapers. I read the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. And then for sports, I read the New York Post. I don't expect anyone else here needs to do that, but I do that. I read The Economist. I like the New Yorker and the Atlantic. For websites, I find our own CFR.org, at the risk of bragging, I think is the best website in the world about the world. I'm obviously a fan of Foreign Affairs, the magazine, and also the website. But I'm a news junkie like everybody else, and I go online and I follow the news. I really like to sometimes go to the documents if I can help it, and then I read things like for Israel, I'll read Haaretz, and I'm lucky I'm on all these various lists, and so I get people who curate the best on China, the best on this, the best on that. But there's no shortage of stuff. I think people though have to be wary a little bit of a lot of the stuff on certain websites ain't great. There's no editing, there's no guaranteeing. So I'd go to, I think for everyone has time constraints or interest constraints, but I would say, read one major newspaper that covers the world. And there's about a half, in this country, there's 4 or 5 that do. I wouldn't spend a lot of time on television. If that's, there's not a lot of shows really about the world. Probably Fareed Zakaria's every once in a while, NPR or PBS. And Michael Krasny on the West Coast is a really smart radio show. And then I think, the council and, what I like curated sites. So what I like about our website is it's the best. That's if we produced it, bully for us. But if we didn't produce it, we'll find it.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up to that, do you think that our media frames everything too much from a US-centric perspective, specifically on foreign policy?
That's interesting. I would have thought the biggest problem was the one you were getting at in your previous question. Our media doesn't cover the world much. So if they framed it in terms of American foreign policy, that'd at least be progress. That means we were at least looking at the world through an American prism. I think the biggest problem is it gets such short shrift and it feeds into the isolationism that I'm worried about. That said, sure, I'm sure we look at international relations and we forget that we're less than 5% of the world's people. We forget that we're what 1/5 of the world's economy. We often, I say one of my rules of foreign policy is before we invade a country, we ought to at least learn about it. We ought not to be surprised afterwards, which too often seems to be the case. So yeah, I think there is a tendency, but the much bigger concern is not that we're American centric. To me, the much bigger concern is we're not sufficiently world centric in terms of our attention.
Thank you. Do you believe that Putin has animus toward the United States? And if so, what should be done to counter that?
It would seem so. Let me take a wild stab. Former KGB official has animus towards the United States. Yeah, it would seem so. I think he actually has a view of Russia's history and Russia's trajectory, which he believes is threatened, whether directly threatened by NATO enlargement or indirectly threatened through what we would call the liberal world order and democratic ideals. So I do think he thinks that to some extent we are implicitly hostile to his idea of Russian greatness. Doesn't in any way justify or excuse anything he's doing, but I do think he does that. And I do think we probably reinforced it through such things as NATO enlargement. He's pushing back though and gone way beyond that in terms of interfering in our elections. Who knows about this latest story about putting bounties on the heads of American soldiers in Afghanistan. He's violated the basic rules of international relations in Ukraine. So look, what I think we ought to do is make ourselves less vulnerable to their interference. But I think we ought to push back a lot more. I think this administration, I disagree with this administration a lot. I think they were right to change the policy and provide arms to Ukraine. I think that was a positive thing. Instead of the weakening NATO, I would be strengthening NATO. I do not want Mr. Putin to ever be tempted. Since he doesn't seem willing to knock off interfering in our politics, I would interfere in his. I would look for ways to use cyber and other tools to weaken his position. If he's going to have the audacity or the outrageous behavior to threaten the lives of American soldiers around the world, well, Russian soldiers are also outside Russia. So I just think we need to push back. And I think he has to understand that there's a price to pay. He cares most about what? His own political position. So I think that also makes him potentially vulnerable in some way. So I think we should be prepared to push back. That said, I also think we should have a dialogue with Putin. I've never thought of diplomacy as a favor. I do think the new president needs to very quickly iron out an extension of the New START agreement. The last thing we need is a new wave of nuclear arms competition with Russia. I've never thought of, I never understood whenever there's a crisis, you kick out ambassadors and you kick people out of groups. No, you have them there, you talk to them, you yell at them if need be. And you explain the consequences, why what they've done is unacceptable, and here's going to be the consequences. So my view is we treat Russia with respect. We do not ostracize them, but where we need to, we push back.
Let me throw a follow-up in there. In the last, 10 years or so, we've seen periodic attempts by Putin and whoever the Chinese leader was at the time to form some kind of working alliance, coalition, common front, whatever it is. How worrisome is that? Is there the potential for a real functioning, coin a terrible term, axis of autocrats?
It's alliterative. I don't think so. I mean, China's 10 times the population of Russia. China's a real economy. It's globally integrated. Russia is more of a European Central Asian power. China's obviously an Asia Pacific power. China's got people, Russia's got territory. They're not really natural economic partners. I think they've got some overlapping strategic interests, but I worry about a lot of things. I got like a long list of stuff that keeps me up at night. Sino-Russian proximity is not one of them. And I mean, it'll be quite funny to see how they react to this question of nuclear arms control and whether it should be bilateral or trilateral. I'm not sure they have necessarily identical interests there. No, but my hunch is they're so different. And I think there's inherent limits, even if there's some tactical overlaps in what they do. I'm more worried about what each of them is up to rather than what they do together.
Thank you. Technology seems to be the 21st century battlefield with AI, cyber warfare, quantum computing, disinformation, and tech companies are quasi-sovereign states. How can the US government work with tech companies to protect national security and perhaps advance foreign policy interests?
Well, I actually think that not just tech companies, but a lot of other entities other than countries are really increasingly important. If you were going to have a meeting about global health, you'd have to have the Gates Foundation, you'd probably have Bloomberg's philanthropies, and you'd probably have any number of drug makers in the room, or biotech companies. If you're going to deal with some humanitarian situation, you probably have the IRC or Doctors Without Borders or other such. So if you're going to deal with technology issues, how could you do it without the Apples, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Twitters, what have you? So yeah, I think they ought to be included. I mean, if I were in their shoes, I wouldn't want a seat in the UN General Assembly. I can't imagine anything more boring. But if you are going to have what I would call kind of designer multilateralism, and you were going to come up with some sort of an ad hoc or ultimately institutionalized framework for dealing with a challenge, sure, you'd want them at the table. How else are you going to deal with issues of privacy or flows of information, trade? They've got to be at the table. So I actually think increasingly we've got to think of multilateralism in a very pragmatic way and create new frameworks. And we ought to be totally agnostic. You basically say, look, who matters here? Who's relevant? Who's got heft? And who could be part of the answer of dealing with this or that? Of dealing with this or that regional or global challenge. So increasingly, yeah, I think they need to be in the room. I have my frustrations with some of the companies, needless to say, at times. And I think there's some big regulatory issues that are going to come to the fore. I'm not a antitrust lawyer. I'm not an expert in telecommunications and other things. But my sense is these companies have grown so large and so powerful that one argument is going to be what I was just talking about. How do we include them in national and international decision making? The other is going to be questions of antitrust and regulation, which is how are they managed? What are the rules? And I think the EU has gone some ways down the road. The more authoritarian countries obviously have some pretty strong views, but I think that's going to be and that's one of those issues that cuts across partisan divides. I think we're going to have some very interesting conversations in this country and around the world about that.
Thank you. In 30 years, 25% of all humans will be African. What economic impact globally would you project?
Yeah, I'm worried about that in the sense that, Africa is just over 1 billion people now. It's going to be over 2 billion, as you say. It's really in most of the world, populations are not going up. They'll go up for a while longer in South Asia, but everywhere else they've kind of leveled off. Africa is the one place that population is skyrocketing. And the problem is, think about it, it's happening at a time where many African countries face real governance challenges. Climate change is making more and more land uninhabitable. We've seen now, how density can cause problems with disease. Plus, the timing of Africa is bad. You're going to have a population boom just at a time a lot of new technologies are coming on stream that are going to replace a lot of existing jobs. So, population in principle can either be a blessing or a burden. My hunch here is it's going to be potentially more of a burden. And what we're looking at is really massive needs for education, for training, for good governance, and so forth. So, nothing again is preordained, but I see this as an enormous challenge for the future of Africa. And, we're talking about, and essentially for the world, given Africa's share is going to be so large.
Thank you. And what is your opinion on American versus Chinese soft power in Africa? Have we been left behind too much? Can we still win the soft power war in Africa?
Well, to the extent we've been left behind, it's not so much because of what China's done, it's what we haven't done. Soft power is in part the example we set. Well, who in the world is going to want to emulate us when it comes to dealing with COVID-19? Who's going to want to emulate our political divisions or our gun culture? So, part of it is just the example we set. I just wrote a piece called Foreign Policy by Example for Foreign Affairs. And that was, we're doing it to ourselves in many cases. We've also, though, weakened our ability, Bob Gates gets this a little bit in his new book, to compete with non-military tools, with aid, with trade, with information. We ought to be strengthening every arm of the government. We've got all these private sector advantages, and that's another area we're hurting ourselves. Our immigration policy is making it tougher for people to come here and study and so forth. So it's almost as if we're out to weaken our soft power. And I think we have so many innate advantages if we would just let them be and fund them properly. If we got out of our own way, we'll do just fine. It's not that China's become 10 feet tall, it's we've reduced our ability to compete.
Thank you. Can you comment on our relationship with Israel and also on the annexation, if you have any insight on that coming out tomorrow?
I have no insight, but I have lots of opinion. Look, my enthusiasm for annexation is negligible. Actually, that's an understatement. It is non-existent. I think it's bad in at least 3 ways. It's obviously bad for Palestinians. It further forecloses opportunities for there ever being a Palestinian state. I think in the immediate situation, though, it could be very bad for stability in places like Jordan. Jordan has preponderance of Palestinians. It has a separate peace with Israel. If I were an Israeli leader, I would be very, very, very careful not to do damage to Jordan and to that relationship. I also think in the long term, it's bad for Israel. Israel is what it is, and it gets a lot of the support it gets in the United States and elsewhere because of what? It's a Jewish state, but it's also a thriving democracy. The problem with annexation and with prolonged occupation of ever-growing numbers of Palestinians, it creates a tension. And at some point, Israel's going to have to choose between being a Jewish state and a democratic state. If it continues with occupation and doesn't give people citizenship, then it's not a democracy. If it gives them all citizenship, then it's not a Jewish state. I do not want Israel to have to make that choice. To me, a two-state solution is good for Palestinians in principle. It's also good for Israelis because it preserves Israel's unique nature and character. So this administration, which presents itself as Israel's great friend, pardon me for disagreeing. I don't see this as doing Israel any favors. Now, again, Israel can't make peace without a Palestinian partner. I get it. What I would advise Israelis leaders now is not to take steps that preclude or foreclose opportunities for peace if and when the Palestinians are willing to meet them halfway.
Thank you. What should the US do regarding Hong Kong, given the passing of the national security law by Beijing?
Look, this is to me a serious breach of international obligations by the Chinese. It was, 23 years ago at the handover, they agreed to one country, two systems. Now we get one country, one system. It's a different conversation of why they might be doing it. In terms of our response, I think we're finally moving in the right direction. I think, look, for years, I don't understand our policy towards Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been a throughput for high technology reaching the mainland. So we ought to shut that down to begin with. After that, we're probably looking at more targeted economic sanctions, but we can't assume. Only put the opposite. We should assume that everything that reaches Hong Kong reaches the mainland. So we shouldn't, I think, allow anything to get to Hong Kong that we're not prepared to see on the mainland. So I would look at the export controls, that sort of thing. And after that, I'd look for more pinpointed sanctions. But the answer is we're going to have to. I think China's decided that whatever price they're going to have to pay, they're prepared to pay it. They wanted either to take advantage of the moment to do things in Hong Kong, or they didn't want any political protest in Hong Kong to catch fire on the mainland or influence Taiwan. So we just have to me, embed this. So we need partially a Hong Kong response, but then we also need a China response. And we ought to look at the totality of our relationship with China. Again, we're not going to turn China into a Jeffersonian democracy. The question is, where do we draw lines and say, if you cross this line in Hong Kong or with the Uyghurs, here's what we're going to do to penalize you.
Thank you. On the topics of protests and what we're seeing in the United States, some have compared what's happening with the civil unrest in our country to, the Arab Spring or other color revolutions. Can you comment on that, just based on your experience of watching those events happen abroad? And also what opportunities authoritarian regimes might be taking to take advantage of the unrest we have in our country?
On the former, I think don't take this wrong. I think what's going on in this country is not equivalent to the colored revolutions. What we're talking about is rooting out racism in this country. We're not talking about turning a democracy into an authoritarian system, an authoritarian system into a democracy. We're not talking about a revolution. We're talking about a major change in our politics and our culture. Long overdue, and it needs to happen. So I think in that sense, the comparisons are not accurate. But what we're seeing though is protest, and people are frustrated by what's happening or not happening through normal political channels. So people have taken to the streets. But at some point, it has to go back into political channels. At the end of the day, protest is not going to bring about the kind of change we want in this country. It's got to be channeled. If all the protesters register and if they vote for candidates who want to become vessels of change, then things will begin to change. Protest per se, protest can stimulate political reform. In and of itself, it is not political reform. The good news about the United States is historically, unlike places where the Arab Spring happened, is we're a society where protests can lead to political change. We're a very different country than we used to be. And that's part of the advantages, it seems to me, of democracies, the ability to change, to self-correct, to address wrongs. So that's our great, historically has been one of our great strengths. We're a very different society. Indeed, when you look at things like protests, on one level, you can say it presents a bad image to the world. Well, maybe because of the violence and all that, but it's a big but. But if protest leads to real change, then I think it sends a powerful message about American democracy and about, again, our ability to improve ourselves. So I'm an optimist, and I hope that's where this ends up. Look, what I hated the other week was when the uniformed military was in the streets of Washington. Talk about undermining our soft power, and made it impossible for us to criticize what the Chinese were doing and other things. And I think we got enough challenges without adding a constitutional crisis as an overlay, and without wrecking one of the great institutions in this country. And by the way, one of our most integrated institutions, which is the military. I think we need to preserve the military. It's got an important set of functions to undertake largely overseas. So hopefully we have stepped back from that brink.
Thank you. Were there events or a set of issues in your career that had a big effect on your worldview?
Well, okay, I'll stall for 10 seconds while I dance and think about sure. When I was at the Pentagon, I went to the Pentagon in '79, and within half a year, you had the revolution in Iran and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And I was one of the people who was yanked into the process of planning what ultimately became the Rapid Deployment Force and now Central Command. Doyle's written about this for years. So it was a reminder of what could happen in the world, but also the ability to respond to it. Like I was at the White House when Saddam invaded Kuwait, and I had to deal with the Middle East crisis there. Also the end of the Cold War. Look, what all of these things affect you. You kind of, to me, the biggest single takeaway of every one of my experiences, and I've been really lucky, is that it shows me how important, if I may borrow from a title of a book I don't much like, it really does depend who's in the room. The people really make a difference, both the person at the top and those that person has around them, and the integrity of the decision-making and deliberative structures. There's almost nothing that's inevitable. Cold War didn't have to end peacefully when it did on the terms it did. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, a different president, he probably would have gotten away with it. We would have reacted differently to the Soviets going into Afghanistan or the Iranian Revolution. Or I remember sitting in the cabinet meeting. It was the first cabinet meeting of the Reagan administration where people debated whether to continue to honor the hostage agreements that Carter had negotiated. Almost everything is up for grabs. What's so interesting about this administration is even more is up for grabs. The range of conversation, which, if I may be permitted to use a football analogy, used to be largely within, say, the 40-yard lines. Now we're kind of in an end zone at the time. And it's just a reminder that the people who happen to be in positions of power have tremendous latitude, particularly in foreign policy, much greater there than it is in domestic policy. Congress actually has less of a role. So it's an argument for young people to get involved, and it's an argument, again, for voters to be informed and to hold these people to account, if they're going to be making all sorts of decisions that are going to totally affect your life.
Let me sneak in a tangential follow-up to that. We're in the middle of an election campaign. There hasn't been much of a debate on foreign policy so far. What there has, to the extent there has been one, it's been on who would be tougher on China.
Yeah.
So my question is a presidential campaign a good opportunity to have a debate on foreign policy, or is it a uniquely bad opportunity to have a debate on foreign policy?
I laugh. Every inch of me wants it to be a good place to have a public conversation about foreign policy for 100 different reasons. It's a bad place to have a conversation about foreign policy. You and I are old enough to remember missile gaps. By and large, things get somewhat, what's the word? Who was it? It might have been Robert Dahl, the political scientist, talked about public debates. And what they do is they tend to take subtle arguments and nuance and tend to make them bold and even crude. And that's what you got to do. Tough on China, weak on China, what have you. And the answer is obviously a smart policy has elements of both. And I think that's I apologize for a little bit of background noise here, a little bit of construction going on outside. If they could stop for a minute, that'd be great. So all things being equal, but it's a dilemma, because on one hand, there's an argument, you don't want to have these arguments done in a context where everything gets taken out of context and coarsened. On the other hand, you don't want to vote for somebody and then wake up and say, oh my God, I didn't realize that was what he or she was going to do. Particularly since in foreign policy, they have all this latitude and discretion. So it is a dilemma. And the word dilemma is overused, but this is a real one. And so, all you can do is hope. And the danger is obviously if a candidate tries to be nuanced and govern and act as if he were governing, they could pay a price, because governing and campaigning are two very different muscles. They're two very different endeavors. So for all things being equal, I reluctantly come to the conclusion that less is probably more when it comes to the debate these days, but I don't like my own conclusion. Well, do you agree with that?
Sorry, missed it?
Agree or disagree with that? You've been covering this now for 4 years. What's your take on that?
No, I agree. Campaigns are full of examples of the pitfall that you are talking about. And so maybe this will, in a strange way, the ideal solution would be for each candidate to have to give 1 or 2 or 3 set piece speeches on principles and issues. There's nobody to police that. Maybe that's what I would do in a second life, is instead of being the Presidential Debate Commission, it would be the Presidential High Policy Commission. It'd be nice to have that. In this case, maybe we're okay in that we pretty much know what President Trump's foreign policy is like, and it's unlikely to change very much. Joe Biden gave a speech last year. He's going to give a speech this year. We'll have some speeches. We may be spared too much of the loss of nuance you're worried about, although that's probably too much to hope for.
Yeah, but you make a good point. Unlike some other elections, we have 2 people with track records. Donald Trump has 4 years of being commander-in-chief, being the incumbent. Joe Biden has 4 decades of public life, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, vice president for 8 years. So unlike a situation where you have a governor or someone coming out of, if you will, a non-foreign policy world, this time, I hadn't thought about it until Doyle said that, this time we actually have 2 candidates who we've got a better sense than usual. So that reinforces my sense that less is more in terms of an immediate current debate.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I know we are running out of time, so thank you so much, Dr. Haass and Doyle, for such an important and thought-provoking discussion. As mentioned, Dr. Haass's new book, The World, A Brief Introduction, is now available. And of course, we encourage you to pick it up from your local bookstore. Tomorrow, we'll be hosting a webinar on crisis leadership, the road to recovery, with Christine Essel, who's the president and CEO of Southern California Grantmakers, Gregory Scott, the president and CEO of Community Action Partnership in Orange County, and Corinne Bendersky, who's a professor of management and organizations at UCLA Anderson. On Thursday, we'll be back with our weekly live stream, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, with Dan Schnurr. And coming up in July, we have great programs on what's currently happening in Syria and with the Assad regime, a Bastille Day event focused on the presidency of Emmanuel Macron, and a talk with an environmentalist on his concerns about climate alarmism and what can be done to address the most threatening concerns to the planet. Please check out our upcoming programs. There is a handout attached on the control panel listing all of our upcoming programs. And also please visit our website, lawac.org, to register for our upcoming events, sign up to become a member, and make a donation. Stay safe, stay informed, and we will see you soon. Dr. Haass and Doyle, thank you again so much for your time today.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Doyle. Be safe.
Thank you.